His body was found early in the morning, covered in death spots, with his mouth open as if screaming into the silence. Dark puncture wounds gaped over his chest, each of which, as it turned out, had a thin iron spike driven into it. The spikes did not touch his heart directly. They surrounded it, as if someone's hand had carefully traced the boundaries of pain. Dark, almost black blood oozed from each hole, curling around it like a crown. Officially, Duke Eberhard von Kaltenberg didn't die. He passed away. This was recorded in the chamber registers, accompanied by the Latin phrase, mortuus in quiet. But the court servants, the guards, the blind chaplain, and the old doctor who had been summoned during the night knew that it was execution. Slow, secret, merciless, but performed with a certain ritual. A month before his death, the Duke was still sitting at the table, although even then his fingers were shaking, and food made him nauseous. He often complained of dreams that do not end even during the day. Dr. Sperling, brought in from Graz, wrote in his report, "He sees needles. There are none in his body, but he screams as if every bone in his body were a pin. His vision is blurred, his flesh trembles, his heart beats like a sparrow in a cage." At the time, this was considered hysteria, and a monk was assigned to him. The monk said nothing, just sat in the corner and prayed. The Duke became quieter. By that time, his chambers began to exude a steady smell of damp earth. Servants complained of headaches and a metallic taste in their mouths. Several times during the night, screams were heard coming from the Duke's bedroom window. In the official records, they were described as sounds of suffering not exceeding the permitted level. One of the bodyguards guarding the door later recounted with a distraught expression that he had heard the Duke begging someone not to bring the fire near his chest. At that time, the castle was not heated. The chambers for night calls, which were usually used for secret councils and confessions, were suddenly filled with strangers. An alchemist from Silesia arrived, along with 2 monks from an old monastery where the possessed were once kept, and an unknown woman in white who spoke a mixture of German and a strange dialect. She was allowed into the Duke's bedroom, but no one knew what she was doing there. Rumor had it that on the first night, she rubbed his chest with a salty solution and left yellow streaks of powder near his heart, which later proved impossible to identify. A week later, the Duke's body was covered with spots, first on his stomach, then on his chest and groin. They did not itch, but pulsated. Sperling insisted on bloodletting twice a day, in the morning and after sunset. The Duke no longer spoke. He whispered. According to the servant who served him his nightly potion, Eberhard repeated 17 times on the day before his death, "They are coming. They are inserting spikes to keep the soul in the body. Don't let them complete the circle." He died when the circle was complete. After his death, his body could not be washed. The water on his skin curled up like milk in acid. 3 attempts were made to wash the blood from his chest, but to no avail. The last person to touch him, a young monk named Tillo, later burned his robe and was found at the town well, dressed only in coarse sackcloth, repeating, "Spikes under my heart, spikes under my heart." No one knew who had driven the iron into the Duke's chest. The castle was guarded twice as heavily that night. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were barred. The Duke slept alone, as he had demanded for the last 2 months. No servant or doctor was allowed to enter without a guard and permission. All that remained were cracks in his fingernails, a twisted torso, and empty eyes that reflected the light of the candles, as if they continued to burn inside him, even after life had left him. But Eberhard's death was not the end. The next morning, the old Kaltenberg flag was raised in the castle, turned upside down. It meant revenge has begun. By lunchtime, a poisoned page was found in the well. A day later, the physician Sperling died. His breath became hot as steam, and his skin was covered with the same spots that had been on the Duke's chest. His body was quickly burned, without even waiting for funeral hymns. And at the main gate, someone carved into the stone with a knife, "Now you too sleep with thorns." There was no signature. By morning, a suffocating silence reigned in the Duke's chambers. The air was thick, like the sheets in which dead babies were once wrapped, clinging to the skin and making it impossible to breathe. The windows were tightly shuttered on his orders, so that no ray of light could touch his face. The servants moved silently, stepping on a layer of straw scattered along the walls, so that the stones would not whisper. On the fourth day after the attack, he stopped speaking. His lips were cracked, and his tongue was coated with a black film. However, his eyes remained open, unblinking, watching every movement. Doctors gathered from the Trier School, the Berg Parish, and the monastery of St. Odilia argued at the Duke's bedside, trying not to raise their voices. One of them, a gray-haired apothecary named Frieder, was the first to venture to say that the breastbone might have been pierced from the inside, if the needles were not wooden but iron, and driven in with particular malice. "Not from the outside, gentlemen. I am inclined to think that these needles were driven into the body not by hand, but by thought," he said in a low voice, rubbing hot wine with yarrow between his fingers. The servants began to disappear, one by one, without a sound, without a cry. They were there in the evening, but gone in the morning. In their place, young novices were brought in, unaware of what awaited them behind the oak door of the Duke's bedchamber. One of them, a 12-year-old novice named Falk, was found dead in the courtyard. His face had been scratched like an icon torn from a nail. His tongue was missing. The night of October 6th to 7 was particularly difficult. The Duke tossed and turned as if something was trying to escape from his chest. He wheezed, tearing his throat, and left bloody marks on the pillows. One of the doctors noticed that with each such attack, the area around his heart darkened, as if the skin were rotting, not outward, but inward. "His heart is like a nest of worms," someone wrote anonymously in the margin of one of the account books. A monastery report sent to Mainz states, "There is a crown of thorns on his body. It is not made of gold, but of anger. Every day it presses harder. The servants are afraid to approach him." One of the servants, Helmut, a commoner from Baden, disappeared during the night. All that remained was his shirt, stuck to the wall like a snake's skin. Lepers, whom the Duke had once ordered to have their noses cut off for theft, appeared at the castle in the pre-dawn mist. They stood silently, wearing white bandages, their arms outstretched toward the tower where the light was burning. Some fell to their knees. Their lips moved. They were not praying, they were cursing. Rumors spread. They said that the Duke had been found in a plague pit as a child, that his mother had died in agony during childbirth, and her body had never been buried, that his cries as a baby had caused the monks to bleed from their noses. All this came up in evening kitchen conversations, was woven into prayers and alarming reports to the capital. His brother, Count Gerhard, who arrived at the castle accompanied by 5 armed knights, demanded to be let in to see his brother. The door was not opened. The court guards, loyal since the days when the Duke was a 13-year-old boy with a sharp dagger, guarded the chambers like a crypt. Gerhard struck the door 3 times with his fist, then disappeared without saying goodbye. In his sleep, the Duke began to whisper. The priest assigned to hear his confession wrote, "His lips moved, but there were no words, only a hissing sound. It sounded like the language of snakes or wind in a pipe. He called someone by name, dozens of names, female, male. Some were repeated. One name, Rutger. He repeated until he closed his eyes. Moisture began to appear on the walls of the bedroom. It dripped from the corners as if the stone were crying. People said it was blood seeping through the masonry or juice from underground tombs. No one dared to check. By the next morning, the Duke's pulse had grown weaker. One of the doctors, unable to bear it, left the castle. The second locked himself in the lower hall and began to write a treatise On the thorns in the heart and the perverted will of God, he hanged himself 3 days later, leaving only unfinished pages behind. Meanwhile, the servants began to hang black scarves on the castle gates. One of them muttered, "He is not dying of illness, but because there is no man living inside him." But no one dared to repeat these words aloud. On the fourth night after the second attack, Duke Gottfried began to cry, not as a ruler, not as a man, but as a disconsolate child. The servants standing behind the screen wrote in their reports, "His tears were unceasing. He begged everyone, even the walls, for forgiveness, without naming his sin." No one dared to approach him. The room smelled of vinegar, rancid fat, wet bandages, honey, and smoke. The windows were kept closed, for it was believed that mice and owls hunted souls. Gottfried's pulse became thread-like. His left hand twitched, as if from electric shocks. The doctors argued. One claimed that it was poison moving toward the heart. Another insisted on a demon in the blood. One of the surgeons ordered a silver spike to be stuck into his wrist to divert the foul currents. The blood flowed weakly, thick as syrup, with dark flakes. When the hand was bandaged, the skin began to turn purple, and after 3 hours, it swelled and became covered with shiny blisters. That same morning, the apothecary who had left a pouch of crushed sage and rue in the Duke's pocket a week earlier was brought down from the attic. He was tied up and thrown into a well. He was close to the body, said the chief of security. Later, when water was scooped out of the well for washing, it smelled of iron. Rumors spread like mice through the corridors of the castle. Some said that the Duke was being tormented by the spirits of the monks he had killed at Tynwald Castle. Others recalled his brother's widow, locked in a windowless tower, who died after biting her nails down to the bone. Her ghost was said to have stood over the Duke on the night he began to urinate blood. Gottfried's peace was guarded day and night. 5 bodyguards with halberds let no one in except his personal barber. But on the third day, it was the barber who disappeared. His body was later found in a salted barrel, his ribs removed from his chest. They were never found. According to the clerk's notes, the murderer acted with ritual precision, as if the victim were part of a spell. By this time, the Duke no longer recognized faces. He called out the name of his long-dead mentor, asked for a crown made of skulls to be brought to him, and whispered about iron birds that were drinking his thoughts. Twice, he tried to tear out his fingernails, muttering, "They read through the skin, through the skin." They tried everything. They called an old witch, who ordered them to rub the Duke's back with goat fat, in which rusty keys had been steeped for a day. They prayed over him, burned incense, and sprinkled the walls with vinegar and salt. He howled. He did not howl with a human voice, but as if the pain itself was pouring out of him. The doctors wrote in their journal, his sound was inhuman, and 3 servants began to bleed from their noses. His flesh began to rot, under his armpits, between his fingers. In his groin, his skin darkened, peeled, and gave off a smell of decay. They tried incense ash, smeared him with honey, and buried him in ashes. It was all in vain. Pieces of skin remained on the sheets. He knew. He screamed, "I'm rotting! I'm here, but I'm rotting!" They dug a ditch in the courtyard. At night, they carried everything they cut from his body there, bandages, pus, moldy cakes. They poured oil over it all and burned it. One night, the flames in the ditch turned green. They said it was the cursed tissue burning. On the 10th day, the disease spread beyond his body. Birds flew around the tower. The water in the fountain in front of the hall became cloudy. Dogs howled in their kennels. The servants' children began to be born dead, or with spots on their foreheads. One cook fell from the stairs, breaking his neck. His mother cried out. He touched the bread he was carrying to the chambers. True madness began to grip not only the Duke, but the entire household. People became silent. The clerk kept records in short phrases: breathing poorly, glassy eyes, asked to be drowned, servants disappeared, 2 hanged themselves in the pantry. They claimed that a voice from the attic had ordered them to do so during the night. No one spoke of illness anymore. Everyone understood this was retribution. But retribution for what? No one knew. Only one old monk, who sent a letter from a ruined monastery in Brunn, wrote. His sins were ingrained, and someone simply took them back. The letter was unsigned. The paper was stained. The text was written in charcoal. But when it was read, one of the guards died in the chambers. His heart stopped. By the morning of the 13th day, the Duke did not move. His lips were parched, his tongue like a worm-eaten rag. He lay on his side, staring at the wall, as if dead, but he was still breathing, so slowly that the glass held to his nostrils remained clear. The guards did not know if he was alive. 2 of them decided to leave. They were found later, frozen to death by the well. A symbol was carved into the chest of one of them, a needle piercing the heart. The chief physician's report stated, his body is beyond description, blue, covered with cracks. His back is covered with ulcers, oozing black fluid. His pulse is unclear. His ears are shriveled. His eyes are glassy. His pupils like those of a dead man. He suggested beginning embalming before death in order to avoid complete decomposition of the tissues. This suggestion caused panic. The Duke's confessor forbade anyone to touch the body until his last breath, claiming he is alive until he has confessed. The confession did not take place. None of the priests entered. One young deacon attempted to do so. On the same day, he began bleeding from the mouth and died in agony. He was buried outside the cemetery. On the 14th day, the palace became a zone of silence. The bells did not ring. The music stopped. People spoke in whispers. An iron nail was driven into the door of the Duke's chambers, as was done in the old days, to prevent the soul without skin from leaving. His servants knelt until their legs grew numb and prayed without words. Mirrors were removed from the corridors. The hall was draped in black cloth. Rumors spread that the Duke was dead, but no one could confirm it. Some said that he was no longer a man, but a vessel for evil. On the 15th day, the door to his chambers opened by itself. A draught swept through the corridor, extinguishing the candles. When the torches were lit again, the Duke was lying in the center of the room on the floor. No one knew how he had gotten down from his bed. His face was disfigured, his jaw was twisted, his eyes sunken. The skin on his chest was torn, and something resembling forged spikes could be seen between his ribs. They were at an acute angle, as if they had been driven in from below while the body was lying on its back. They stuck out, rusty, but seemingly fused to the flesh. No one dared to touch them. Half an hour later, a council of 6 men gathered. It was decided to wrap the body in shrouds, pour wax over it, and secretly carry it to the ice cave. The official announcement was, His Highness has withdrawn into fasting and silence. But rumors spread beyond the castle within a day. In Munich, people whispered, the needles took his soul. In Salzburg, they wrote on the walls, he who has not confessed will not die a human being. They tried to embalm the body. The first anatomist vomited during the autopsy. The second fainted. The third, an old man with one eye, muttered, this is not a corpse, this is a vessel. He was later found in the basement, hanged by his feet. Written on the wall in charcoal were the words, he asked him not to take them out. The Duke's remains were buried at night, without bells, without a funeral service. The grave was filled with tar and covered with bricks, but even then, a creaking sound could be heard coming from under the ground, as if a nail were hitting a stone. One guard who was present at the burial later said, I felt the ground shaking, as if he were moving. After his death, famine began. The crops rotted. The water became murky. Children fell ill. Trials of servants began. along with searches of chambers and bans on mentioning the Duke's name. The old people whispered that the needles were revenge, or a seal to keep him inside. A monk who sent a treatise to Bamberg wrote, "When sin merges with flesh, it seeks a way out through metal, and if it is not confessed, the needle seeks the heart." In the end, the castle was deserted. Everyone left. The last to go were the monks, who carried a box out of the attic in which they found maps with a burnt mark, exactly where the palace had stood. In the center was a circle with a cross. Underneath it was an inscription. 7 were killed, not one was torn out. That is how the Duke died, or did he? People still argue about it, but in his former chambers, they say, you can hear a scraping sound, as if someone without a mouth is still scraping a needle against the stone.